All right, we are going to talk briefly about evolution today in this presentation. So I say we get right on it and get started. Um, with regard to evolution, this will kind of start our final unit where we will discuss evolution, we will discuss biodiversity, we will discuss some ecology issues, and we will discuss some of the human interactions, specifically the nervous system. So this is a picture of some of the finches that were collected by Charles Darwin on his second voyage of the HMS Beagle. Whenever we're talking about evolution, one of the major records that we have of evolution is the fossil record. Scientists in the 17th, 18th century, they struggled to explain what some of the fossils were, some of the organisms were, some of the animals that they found in some of the rocks. Some of people used to suggest that they fell from the sky. Some suggested that they grew out of the rock. Some suggested that they were just put there. Um, Nicholas Steno was studying a large shark that had been caught by a fisherman. He noticed the teeth resembled some of those stony objects that they found in rocks. What we see here is he started questioning how solid objects could be found in other solid objects or rocks. And what he eventually concluded was that there were layers of the rock or strata that had formed around these fossils. And we can see that here. We see the stratas and the different layers forming, and this kind of gives us what we call the geologic time scale. So he realized that the youngest layers of rock were on the top and the older layers were on the bottom, and that this helped begin the process of determining the approximate age of each fossil. So catastrophism, a French scientist, Cuvier, studied fossils throughout the 18th century. And what he discovered was that, this whole concept of paleontology, which is kind of making two extremely important observations about fossils. Paleontology is studying the fossils. What he discovered were that the younger fossils were taken from the upper rock resembled more modern species. The older species were taken from lower and much older rock, taken from lower. And he published the differences between the fossils and established them as separate species. So he was able to start telling us about these different species, about several of them. So this is, fossil evidence is the only thing we have for some of these ancient species that we have lost. He also published multiple examples of large mammals that resembled no living species that we have today, being they've gone extinct, but we have this entire complete fossil record of them. So we can see, several of them: the Irish elk, the giant sloth, a blank slide. No, I'm kidding. Although he did not coin the terms, he documented evidence of two very important evolutionary processes. He documented extinction, and he documented the emergence of a new species called speciation. He also explained that extinction of the giant vertebrates he studied as a result of the periodic catastrophes or natural disasters had wiped out some of those species. This idea was called catastrophism, and many of the scientists at the time believed it to be linked to something that was biblical. So then we had this idea of gradualism, and a geologist named Lyell disagreed with Cuvier that it wasn't catastrophism, it was this gradualism. And this was more of a uniformitarianism idea, that the Earth had been slowly transformed and we were just seeing a series of tiny changes within the Earth. And things like erosion, which were moving things around, the rise and fall of ocean levels, volcanic eruptions, all these natural processes that we had were giving us these different gradualism things. And he said that this was influenced and explained many adaptations of variations of these organisms. Baptiste Lamarck hypothesized that animals adapted to their environments, and their muscles and organs actually changed over time due to use or disuse. We see a picture of a giraffe here because he actually thought that over time giraffes' necks just got longer, when we know that really wasn't the case. That these acquired traits would then be passed on to the next generation. So giraffes don't have gadget necks, just so we're clear here. Then Charles Darwin came along and started publishing some of his journeys. He took out in a ship and left and made some journeys. He went down around South America, then around down through the South Pacific, around Australia, back around Southern Africa, and then back in. So he took quite a bit of a trip. He took Lyell's book and he started doing some experimenting and observing really of his own. And he witnessed Earth's changes. First, he seen a massive earthquake in Chile, which was an 8.2 earthquake that left a lot of devastation that he drew pictures of. The earthquake devastated the city, but he noted that it didn't affect the marine life. Clusters of mussels could be found several feet above the shoreline that were dead and rotting. So, the effect of the marine life was that they were displaced, essentially, by this natural disaster. Given enough time, Darwin believed that these mussel shells would one day become fossils, and that maybe these were some of the fossils that were on top of the Andes Mountains. These are mussels that have actually been found in the Andes Mountains, and you can see how large they are. These are fossilized structures of mussels. And he ascended and confirmed that indeed these fossils were ancient marine shellfish that were present. So he knew that the Earth must be millions of years old because eventually these had gotten pushed up into the higher elevations. The water didn't push them up there, but the land upheavals had pushed them up there. The last stop on the Beagle was the Galapagos Islands, which was a series of volcanic islands west of Ecuador. One of the most striking things about the animals in the island was the fear toward humans. And after watching the lizard that was partly buried in the sand, he wrote this. I walked up and pulled it by the tail, and it was greatly astonished, and soon shuffled up to see what was the matter, and then stared me in the face as much as to say as to, why did you pull my tail? Basically, they had had no human interactions, so they didn't know to be afraid of animals. So he also started making some observations about a series of specimens, including birds that he took from each island. He initially assumed that the birds were all of the same species, but experts in England later discovered that they were related, but they were actually different species. So we had a cactus bird that lived on the ground, we had another ground finch that lived here, and we had a warbler which lived more up in the trees. Each species differed mainly in the size and shape of their beaks. Each was adapted for a different food source, crushing seeds, picking out insects, or eating the cactus flowers. And you can look here and see the beak shapes on these. So this is more one. These are sharper and pointier. These are shorter and stubbier. So you can see the differences. So what this led him to believe was this process of adaptive radiation. He discovered in this adaptive radiation, which is where a species rapidly diversifies into new forms. This occurs most when an organism encounters a new or a changed ecosystem. New ecosystems are spaces or roles that are organisms within play. So basically what we were saying here was we had an ancestral seed-eating finch, and that because of what was available to them, some of them stayed seed eaters, some of them became cactus eaters, some became insect eaters, whether they were a probing insect eater, whether they were a grasping insect eater. Some of them became fruit eaters. This developed their new niche within this ecosystem. Then he kind of came up with this other idea of that was really published on the origin of species. It was artificial or natural selection. He established that adaptive radiation was occurring in living organisms. And on the origin of species, he kind of used this example of dog breeding. Dog breeding is something that we have done that's artificial selection. All breeds of dogs descended from gray wolves way back when, but we have artificially bred them for different characteristics. size, color, temperament, jobs, all of these different kinds of things that have done this artificial selection. The same thing has happened with different plants. Artificial selection is applied. We talked about Gregor Mendel. He did some of this artificial selection as well. Cabbage, Brussels sprouts, other vegetables are all derived from potentially what they think was the wild mustard plant. Then natural selection. Natural selection is where traits were favorable in one species, and that allowed that species to be able to reproduce and survive better. This is called natural selection. Darwin based this idea on a series of observation and inferences. So he started observing that all species were capable of producing offspring and capable of producing more offspring than the environment could support. This term was called fecundity or superfecundity. This means, in the example we have here in the picture, is frog eggs. They lay thousands of eggs, and maybe tens will survive. So, it's saturation, essentially, is what we're looking at. The second observation was that general population numbers tend to be stable. This kind of reconciles superfecundity because there were limited resources, which meant that even if they were all hatched or all born, they wouldn't all live to adulthood. And that substances that were required for normal growth, nutrients, water, space, all of those things would only allow a certain amount of organisms to survive. That food, water, shelter, all those resources would limit that. Also, he noted that competition would be part of it. The first three observations led Darwin to a very important inference that organisms compete with each other across species for access to resources. So, if this occurs amongst members of the same species, it would be called intraspecific competition. Intra meaning outside of the species. If it occurs within, it would be interspecific. So we have Asian beetles here. This has to do with the fourth observation, is that a population can vary within traits, and we can see different sizes, a little bit different shapes, and definitely different colors that we have here. So this variation could be based on where they live, could be based on a variety of different things. And we've talked about these traits and how they come about for that incomplete traits. To make his fifth observation, Darwin consulted with plant and animal breeders and confirmed that many differences in traits were possessed by individuals are passed to their offspring. So he was kind of going through some of this, knowing that Mendel had done some things. This is years later. So he started coming up with theories of evolution. He combined his observations and his inferences to form the basis of the theory of evolution. He said that survival depends in part on inherited traits. Individuals that reproduce the most will pass these traits to their offspring. Natural selection is the engine that drives the evolution. The extinction of some species and speciation natural selection is the engine that drives evolution. The extinction of some species and the speciation of new ones has to do with natural selection here. So also what he noticed was that over time, organisms will adapt to their environment. If the environment changes, different adaptations would be favored. Modern Homo sapiens are where we're kind of at now, okay? And if we're looking at this on kind of a 24-hour time scale, and this is kind of taking into account, kind of trying to put this into perspective a little bit. If this is the average life on Earth here. So if life began about between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago, it was quite some time before we even started to notice the expansion of life. This was probably only organismal life, single-celled organisms for the longest time. Then we start getting some multicellular organisms in 760, 780 million years ago. Then we start getting some more complex organisms in the 500 million years ago. We get some larger organisms. Notice a lot of these have aquatic structures on them as we move through here until we get to some of more terrestrial species here that we look with insects, amphibians start to invade land. And then we get into the age of reptiles. We get into dinosaurs between 225 and 65 million years ago before mammals start to show up to where we get modern humans. So we are relatively new in the grand scheme of things, just to be clear. But he kind of showed that this natural selection process is a way to kind of get us through the current diversity of life and how life has emerged over billions of years. So he said that there were 4 ecological factors that encourage natural selection. Those are physiological stress, which is an inappropriate level of critical environmental factors. Could be moisture, light, or pH. He said that predation would be part of it, when one organism is hunted or killed by another. There would be competition, which was the result of organisms attempting to use the same resource. And there would be sexual selection. This occurs usually when the female responds to specific behaviors or physical traits of the male. This is why we see males in most animal species have more bright colors, more plumage, they're bigger, they're stronger. This is why we see a lot of these, is because males have those traits in other species to attract the females. So let's talk about predation. The presence of predators will cause and encourage the selection of individuals with traits to defend against those predators. So like a porcupine has a trait to defend against a predator. We have competition here, both interspecific and intraspecific, so within and outside of the species. There's competition that will ensure that weaker, less fit individuals survive and reproduce less often. This evolutionary basis of males will fight over access to females. So the stronger wins the fight, the stronger reproduces, the offspring tend to be stronger. Then there's sexual selection here. He struggled to understand why evolution could produce birds with brightly colored males. Then, he started studying peacocks, and he noticed that the male peacocks have the big plumage and the bright colors and everything, and that the peacocks that had the larger tails, brighter colors, were the ones that were being attracted to the females, or the females were attracted to, and they reproduced more. So thus they would become a more suitable mate in the eyes of the female. So we'll talk a little bit about physiological stress here. When the right level of environmental factors are present, the populations grow to their peak, or in the optimum range. This is where the optimum range species are abundant. When it gets to be too little, we get into physiological stress. If it gets to be a little too much, we get physiological stress. The species is still there, but they're infrequent. If it gets to where the species can't survive, they become intolerant. And when they become intolerant, the species doesn't exist. So the weaker, less adapted individuals are selected against at that point. So a zone of intolerance means that the population dies out. So, since Darwin published his theory, the adaptations present in living organisms have been classified into 3 types. Physical adaptations, which are structural differences in coloration, body shape, musculature. Behavioral adaptations include migration or marking of a territory. Physiological adaptations, such as skin tanning, occur at the cellular or tissue level of the organism. So physical, behavioral, physiological adaptations that can occur. The gorilla is physically adapted for living and feeding on the ground, while chimpanzees can gather food from trees. So we have evidence of evolution that takes place. Evolution has become a widely accepted theory due to the volume of evidence that we have for it. One example are homologous structures, which are specific anatomical parts that show variations on a common design. So we have the human arm, we have the front leg of a cat, we have the dorsal fin of a whale, and we have the wing of a bat. We talked about these a little bit. This is the embryonic development of different animals. You can see a salamander, a human, a rabbit, a chicken, and a fish. When you look at them in the beginning and you look at all of the different developments here, you can see a lot of the similarities. All vertebrates have gill slits that present in the pharynx region of their embryos. That's right here. This is what we're looking at, those gill slits. So all vertebrates have those whenever they are embryos. So vestigial organs are shrunken remnants of structures that were more useful in ancestral forms of a species. A human example is the appendix. It's considered a vestigial structure from ancestors that ate more plant stems and leaves and needed that for digestion. So we also have this theory or the study of biogeography, which is the geographic distribution of species. What we're looking at here was sort of Pangea and what we have for some of these fossil remains. He noted that species he observed on the Galapagos Islands were much more similar to those in nearby South America as opposed to more distant but ecological similar islands. Fossils of animals and plants alive during the time of the supercontinent Pangea are now found across multiple continents. Also, we started figuring out molecular homologies and sequences of DNA. The total genome of humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos is about 99% the same. So when we look at that, we have about 99% the same DNA, which kind of suggested that we had a tree of life through this evolutionary structure. And this is a pretty convoluted process here that we have to look at. And when we look at some of these, and we go back to kind of those single-celled common ancestors here, and then kind of adapted out from the eubacterias, mitochondria developed. Remember, we talked about way back at the beginning the endosymbiotic theory, and then plants take off over here, fungi take off in here. We have some animals that take off here, insects take off over here. Animals develop out into eventually where we get into humans, clear up here at the end of some of these evolutionary trends. So that kind of led him to believe that we have micro and macro evolution. All of the observations made prior to Darwin were part of macroevolution. The entire species changed. It had gone extinct or it had diverged into new species. But for macroevolution to be possible, there must have been microevolution. And microevolution was the mechanism that causes changes with frequencies or changes within the alleles of a population. Today, we know that these causes of individual differences in the alleles were random mutations within DNA. So, for example, we've talked about the sickle cell gene or sickle cell anemia is a result of that single substitution mutation. This changes the shape of the hemoglobin of the red blood cell and changes the entire red blood cell. Sickle cell anemia cells have that sickle shape. And what happens then is the blood can flow freely when they're non-sickle celled, but when they are sickle celled, they tend to pile up and can cause the hemoglobin to get blocked up. They do not transport oxygen as well, and without successful treatment, they tend not to live as long. This causes the tissues to become oxygen deprived. Also, It also has to do with susceptibility to malaria. Individuals with sickle cell anemia or are heterozygous carriers have an advantage of being resistant to the disease malaria because it is a blood-borne infection and it doesn't take in as well with that. So the gene pool or total collection of genes is much more likely to contain the allele for sickle cell anemia if malaria is prevalent. So it's thought to have actually been an adaptation. Sickle cell was thought to be an adaptation to help people not contract malaria. Then we get into the Hardy-Weinberg principle. This is the independent assortment. We're not going to get into this too much and calculate the equilibrium from microevolution, calculating how populations can occur. This is a lot of information. Kind of have an overall understanding of Hardy-Weinberg, but we won't be doing the equation at all. But understand that it can tell us about how many mutations we can expect, but we will not be doing these calculations for this class. So, it comes out and tells us exactly how to expect and how much to expect to occur, but we're not going to do those calculations. So that is evolution.